Nevada desert, 1945. The trucks stopped in a cloud of dust and heat. 6 Wehrmacht engineers stepped down, their eyes covered, boots sinking into the loose sand. The air was silent. No birds, no engines, only the desert wind, brushing across metal and stone. One American officer, face unreadable, spoke just one sentence. "You built rockets. We built silence." No one replied. The prisoners could not see his face, but they heard the calm weight in his voice. That sentence would follow them for decades. They had spent years inside the roaring noise of war, engines, explosions, speeches, applause. Noise was power. Noise meant victory. Yet here, in this endless silence of sand and sky, they felt something heavier than chains. The quiet was not weakness, it was control. The United States had no need to shout. It had already done something unspeakable. When the blindfolds came off, the men blinked against the burning light. The landscape stretched forever, flat, white, empty. There were towers in the distance, thin lines of steel glinting in the heat. The sun turned their shadows sharp and long. One of them, Meinhardt, muttered, "If this is a prison, it has no walls." A guard smirked, tossing a canteen toward him. "You're standing inside one." The desert was not a cage made of barbed wire, but of knowledge. Every direction led to secrecy. Behind the ridges were laboratories that no German map had ever marked, guarded not by rifles, but by mathematics. That afternoon, the Americans gave them notebooks, pencils, and a warning. No sketches, no names. You're here to observe. It was not punishment. It was demonstration. Inside the barracks, Meinhardt could not sleep. He wrote in a stolen scrap of paper, "We were told America was the land of Ford, Coca-Cola, and jazz. But today I saw a power that does not dance. It waits." He thought of Peenemünde, the rocket base they once called the Spear of the Future. They had built machines that screamed into the heavens. But here, in this silence, even the sky seemed afraid to echo. That night, as stars rose over the Nevada sand, the wind turned cold. The German engineers lay awake, realizing that the true weapon of America was not just its factories or its bombers. It was this, its ability to say nothing and still be feared. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it in your corner of the world? The next morning, the sun rose sharp and merciless over the convoy. The 6 engineers were herded toward a cluster of wooden buildings surrounded by fences and guard towers. They braced for the familiar smell of barracks, sweat, and confinement. But as they stepped inside, everything felt wrong. There were no bunks, no prison guards shouting orders. Instead, there were corridors lined with humming machines, men in white coats, and strange signs that read, "Property of the Manhattan Engineering District." At first, the Germans exchanged glances. Engineering District? It sounded bureaucratic, harmless, but beneath those plain words was a universe of danger. One of them whispered, "District, not a camp, an empire." A door opened, and blinding light spilled from a chamber filled with glass tubes and thick cables that coiled like veins through the concrete. The air smelled faintly of ozone. American technicians, some women, some black, moved swiftly between consoles, checking readings, scribbling notes, laughing under their breath. Their faces were calm, their movements unhurried. Captain Henry Wallace, the escorting officer, gestured toward the scene and said flatly, "Gentlemen, you're not here to design weapons. You're here to understand what you lost." The Germans stood frozen. What they saw defied everything Goebbels' propaganda had told them. They had been taught that American science was chaos, disorganized, driven by money and entertainment, incapable of deep precision. Yet here, inside this desert compound, order and innovation intertwined like architecture and music. Engineer Carl Brenner stared at a wall of instruments where glowing needles twitched to invisible pulses. "It's like a symphony," he murmured. "But who conducts it?" A young American woman nearby overheard. She smiled slightly. "Nobody, the data does." It was the first time any of them had seen women in control of complex machines. Back home, female technicians were secretaries, not scientists. Here, one directed 3 men twice her age. The sight struck deeper than any weapon. It revealed a nation where intelligence outranked uniform. At lunch, the engineers whispered among themselves. "What is this place really?" one asked. Another replied, "If they have a project this size in the middle of nowhere, then maybe they've already won with something we can't see." In the afternoon, they passed a laboratory humming with a low vibration. Inside stood a steel cylinder 6 meters tall, surrounded by copper wiring and insulated pipes carrying liquid nitrogen. The guide said only, "Experimental reactor cooling system." The Germans could barely process it. In 1945, Germany had only theorized such mechanisms. The Americans were already testing them in the desert heat. That night, Meinhardt wrote another line in his notebook. "They don't shout their triumphs, they illuminate them." Outside, the stars were brighter than any city light. Beneath them, buried in sand and secrecy, a new kind of power was being born. Not built for ideology, but for inevitability. By the third day, the Germans began to realize they were not surrounded by guards, but by ideas. There were no shouted orders, no salutes. The Americans worked in shirts rolled to the elbow, smoking casually beside the very equipment that could kill them if miswired. The sight disturbed the prisoners more than any weapon could. In Germany, every scientist had worn a uniform. Even mathematicians signed papers with Heil Hitler. But here, inside these desert labs, no one saluted anyone. Authority lived in results, not in rank. Karl Brenner watched a group of young technicians arguing over an oscilloscope. Their voices rose, but the argument carried laughter. One slammed a wrench down and said, "That won't work unless we rewire the whole feed." The others laughed and shouted back, "Then let's prove it." Minutes later, they had rearranged the experiment, and it worked. Applause broke out. A stunned German engineer whispered, "If we argued like that in Peenemünde, we'd be reported to the Gestapo by lunch." Another, more bitter, muttered, "And here they turn rebellion into discovery." Across the room, an American physicist overheard. He looked up from his calculations and said, almost kindly, "Here, no one gives orders to the truth." It was said casually, but it hit like a strike of lightning. For years, German science had been chained to military ambition, to rockets, to vengeance weapons, to obedience. Now they were watching a culture where contradiction was not punished but refined. Freedom itself had become a laboratory condition. Later that evening, Meinhardt joined 2 of the American engineers outside. They sat on wooden crates eating canned peaches straight from the tin. One of them asked lightly, "You ever think about why you built rockets?" Meinhardt hesitated, "To prove we could reach higher than anyone else." The American shrugged. "We build to reach further, not higher." He didn't explain the difference. He didn't need to. That night, the Germans lay awake, thinking about what they had witnessed. In their homeland, brilliance had meant precision and obedience. Here, it meant curiosity and risk. Their old equations of power no longer balanced. In his notebook, Brenner wrote, "I saw a man laugh while defying his superior, and the superior thanked him. They say energy cannot be created or destroyed. Perhaps that is wrong. Freedom creates energy." The hum of the desert laboratory carried into the night, an invisible rhythm of invention, born not from fear, but from faith in the unknown. By midnight, the prisoners realized something chilling. They had been defeated long before they lost the war. The desert wind had turned cold by noon, carrying the scent of metal and oil from the distant hangars. The guards called it a lunch break, but for the 6 German engineers, it was another experiment. Not of machines, but of humanity. Each man was handed a tin box wrapped in wax paper. Inside, a sandwich layered with ham, a red apple, a small carton of cold milk, and a bar of chocolate. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The Americans ate without ceremony, laughing, tossing apple cores to the sand. The Germans hesitated, staring at the freshness of the food. In 1945, back home, their families were boiling potato peels for soup. Berlin was rubble. Bremen had no bread. Munich smelled of smoke and hunger. Meinhardt held the apple in his hand, its skin shining in the sunlight like something unreal. He thought of his wife waiting in a basement in Dresden, of the last letter she'd sent months before the firestorm. He took one bite and froze. The sweetness hit him like a memory of a life that no longer existed. His eyes filled. He turned away, embarrassed. The American corporal beside him noticed and said softly, "That's from Oregon. Grew on a tree that's still standing." Meinhardt nodded. but couldn't answer. He bit again. Around him, the others ate slowly, almost reverently, as though each bite were a confession. Brenner whispered, "Their science builds bombs, but also refrigerators." That single sentence held a whole truth. The power of America wasn't just its laboratories or weapons. It was that it could feed both its people and its enemies at once. Technology here didn't just destroy, it provided, preserved, multiplied. Across the camp, an American truck unloaded crates of ice blocks. The heat turned them into mist within minutes. The Germans stared. Ice in the desert, cold milk in the desert, apples that had traveled thousands of kilometers. It wasn't luxury, it was logistics. One of the engineers murmured, "They've conquered temperature itself." At that moment, silence fell over the group. It was not fear, not awe, but humiliation. They had built V-2 rockets to prove supremacy, and yet these people had built a system where even a prisoner could eat fresh fruit in the desert. That night, Meinhardt wrote in his notebook, "The most painful thing today was not defeat. It was kindness. It was the taste of something we thought impossible, abundance." The desert cooled. A radio somewhere played a slow jazz tune. In the quiet, the Germans sat on their cots, each holding the memory of that apple, a simple fruit that had stripped them of every illusion they'd ever served. Before dawn, the guards came without a word. The Germans were ordered to dress and follow. The air was thin and cold, the stars still visible over the Nevada horizon. None of the prisoners knew why they were being moved again. They rode in silence, 6 men in the back of an open truck, the desert wind stinging their faces. The only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. When the convoy stopped, they were given dark protective goggles. "Put them on and keep them on," an officer said. No explanation, no threats, only procedure. They obeyed. Minutes passed. The desert seemed endless, and then it began. A flash. White. Blinding. For an instant, night was gone. The entire horizon turned into daylight so pure it had no color. The heat came next, not as flame, but as a pressure, a silent wave that moved through their chests, through the ground, through memory itself. No explosion, no roar, just an unbearable brightness that erased every shadow. One of the engineers fell to his knees. Another whispered, trembling, "God had verloren. God has lost." There was no laughter, no applause. The Americans stood motionless, faces lit by reflected fire, eyes hidden behind glass. For them, it was a test. For the Germans, it was revelation. This was not power born from ideology or hatred or revenge. It was science detached from mercy, a force neither divine nor demonic, but utterly human. The weapon that could end a city began as a calculation on a chalkboard. The boundary between genius and guilt had been burned away by light. When the glow faded, the desert fell silent again. The sky returned to its pale blue. The wind resumed its soft whisper, and the men stood blinking behind their blackened lenses. A few miles away, where the ground had once been solid, a shallow crater smoked gently. Brenner removed his goggles slowly. "We thought we were ahead," he murmured. "Now I think we never even started." An American scientist near him, perhaps in his 20s, still with acne on his chin, simply said, "You just saw what curiosity does when no one stops it." The Germans looked at him, at his youth, his calm voice, the absence of pride. It was as if they had glimpsed not the future, but the end of everything that had defined their past. They would never speak of that morning again. But in their notebooks, they all wrote the same thing. "We watched the day when pride died, and it was beautiful." Would you have believed it if you were standing there, if you saw daylight born from silence? The camp returned to routine, but nothing felt routine anymore. The desert wind carried a strange stillness, as if the sand itself remembered the flash. The Germans no longer asked questions, they simply observed. The Americans, once guarded and formal, now treated them with a quiet respect, as though the shared sight of that terrible light had dissolved the line between victor and vanquished. One evening, Meinhardt sat outside the barracks with an American physicist named Robert Hall. The sky above them was violet, the air trembling with distant heat. They watched a jeep fade into the horizon. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, Meinhardt asked, "You built that thing for victory?" Hall's answer came softly, "No, for knowledge, but knowledge doesn't ask what it costs." Meinhardt stared at him. You think it was worth it? The American hesitated, his eyes on the darkening sky. Ask me in 50 years, if we're still here to answer. It was not arrogance, not pride. It was the tone of a man who had glimpsed the abyss and was unsure which side he stood on. The Germans had believed they'd seen the ultimate weapon, the end of war. Instead, they saw the end of certainty. That night, Brenner joined a group of American scientists at the canteen. They spoke about isotopes, reactors, and something called fusion. Brenner listened in silence. He realized that the Americans were already moving beyond the bomb, that while Germany had been conquered by defeat, America was conquering itself through curiosity. A rumor spread through the camp that the scientists from Los Alamos didn't sleep, that some were haunted by dreams of the light they'd created. One guard whispered that a young physicist had resigned the project, saying, "We made the sun, but forgot to make the dawn." The Germans didn't know if it was true, but the words felt real. For the first time, they saw Americans not as conquerors, but as men, burdened by the same moral weight that had crushed Europe. Later, Meinhardt wrote in his diary, "When we built rockets, we believed we were advancing mankind. When they built the bomb, they questioned whether mankind should advance at all." He closed the notebook and stared into the desert night. The stars shimmered, cold and distant, as if reflecting the same question back to Earth. If the price of knowledge is innocence, how much progress can the world afford before it destroys itself? And if you had the power to create such light, would you dare to turn it on again? 30 years later, in the spring of 1975, the desert had changed, but the silence had not. The old road from Alamogordo was now paved, the fences replaced by warning signs. A gray-haired man stepped out of a rental car, his shoes sinking softly into the dust. It was Meinhardt. He had returned alone. The wind carried the same dry scent of sand and metal. The place where the explosion once burned was now a shallow crater, fenced by rusted wire and a plaque that read, "Trinity Site, July 16, 1945. He stood there for a long time, hat in hand, his breath shallow. He had spent the decades since the war teaching engineering in Stuttgart, speaking rarely of what he had seen. His students knew him as a quiet man, efficient, patient, almost ascetic. Only his notebooks, hidden in a locked drawer, told another story, one of disbelief, envy, fear, and awakening. Now, in the stillness of the same desert, he opened that notebook again. The paper had yellowed, but the ink remained dark and steady. On the final page, he had written, "The day I saw the bomb, I stopped fearing America. I began fearing mankind." He looked up. The horizon was unchanged, endless. But the world beyond it was no longer the same. The United States and the Soviet Union had both built arsenals capable of burning the sky. The laboratories that once symbolized hope now built weapons in silence. Humanity had inherited the light, but not the wisdom. As the sun began to rise, Meinhardt saw his shadow stretch across the sand, long, thin, fragile. He thought of Brenner, who had died 10 years earlier in Hamburg, still haunted by that white flash. He thought of the American physicist Hall, whose letter he'd received in 1953. "We're still here, but I'm not sure we should be proud." The wind lifted a corner of the notebook. Meinhardt closed it gently and whispered, "We wanted to touch the stars. We forgot how to be human." He turned toward the light, and for a brief moment, the desert seemed to glow again. Not from radiation, but from memory. The silence that once terrified him now felt sacred. When people spoke later of that war, they spoke of victory, defeat, territory, and treaties. But for those who had seen the desert light, none of those words meant anything anymore. The true boundary between nations had never been land. It was conscience. He left the notebook under a small white stone by the fence, then walked away without looking back. The wind buried his footprints almost instantly. When the Germans realized that America was not just powerful, but afraid of its own power, that was the real victory. History often remembers only the blast, the sound, the heat, the power that ended a war. But beneath that light were men who learned that knowledge, once freed, can never be controlled again. The desert of Nevada was not just a testing ground for weapons. It was a testing ground for humanity itself. Those 6 German engineers had arrived as prisoners, bound by defeat and arrogance. They left as witnesses to a transformation greater than conquest. The moment when human intellect surpassed moral comprehension. The silence they once feared became a mirror, showing them what civilization looks like when it outgrows its soul. America's strength did not lie in its bombs or factories. It lay in its capacity to question itself, to doubt victory, to fear success. That, Meinhardt realized, was what kept it alive and what might someday save the world. He died quietly in 1981, the desert still in his dreams, the apple still in his memory. Somewhere in that vast emptiness, his notebook remains, buried under white sand, its final words blurred but unforgotten, a warning written not in anger, but in awe. And if you ever stand in the Nevada wind and feel the world fall silent, remember, it is not just history whispering, it is conscience.